for jumping in as a guest speaker. Really appreciate it. Yeah. To the recording section, we are recording this call. For anyone watching the recording, this is happening inside of the Cartesi Discord. Please join us. This call takes place about once a month. And if you're watching the recording, we'd love to have you in here to actually be with us live and converse and ask your questions. So please join. We will also be a couple quick updates. We will be at ETH Global Paris. David, I don't know if you'll be at UCC, but awesome, cool. Yeah, so we'll also be at ETH Global Paris. So if anyone wants to hack a bit on Cartesi, we have some prizes as usual. Good opportunity to try to build some games as well. We're in the game builder call, so why not? If you're around, please let us know, and would be great to meet up. A quick one slider on Cartesi for anyone new here. Basically, Cartesi is infrastructure for app-specific rollups, meaning this gives your application the full power of a CPU. Obviously, for games, this is quite interesting if you want to do more complex stuff on-chain. The second advantage is this expressive general-purpose execution environment. We have this deterministic RISC-V virtual machine, which boots a Linux operating system. This means that you can essentially run almost traditional software inside of the Cartesi machine and have it run in a verifiable way. So anything that runs on Linux essentially can run inside of a Cartesi machine, from physics engines, for example, in the context of games, all the way to, libraries such as OpenCV and so on. You can read about that online as well if you're interested. Now let's get to the agenda. So we'll have a couple of very quick project updates from Ultrachess, Dazzle, and a few more like prototypey things that are happening. We'll have our awesome guest speaker, David, here. We can have I don't know, David, if you have a presentation or not. If you don't, that's fine. We can have like a Q&A. I have a bunch of questions for you as well. And then we can enter a discussion session and, just jam on different topics. So yeah, let's get started. Really excited. Thanks everyone for joining again. And let's start off with some quick project updates. So on the Ultrachess side, I spoke to Jesse. There's nothing major that is new. For anyone new, as a reminder, Jesse's building Ultrachess, which is an on-chain AI chess arena. Basically, you can upload your bots. Anything that is UCI compliant can be uploaded and deployed basically within a Cartesi machine, and these bots can then compete against each other. So, we see here how you can basically challenge. You can place a wager in a certain game with your bot, and then your bot will compete against another bot basically. And this happens, fully on chain and is fully verifiable, which is super cool. If you haven't yet, follow Ultrachess on Twitter. Jesse's also in the audience right now, Blockchain. He might ask some questions later on. Jesse, if you want to jump up, feel free, but you mentioned there were no specific updates, so I won't take too long here. We've discussed this last week as well. Teddy, you want to give a quick update on Dazzle? Teddy, I don't know if you're saying anything, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, I can hear.
Okay. In the meantime, just to recap a bit what Dazzle is about, and worst case, we can jump back to Teddy in a bit when when everything is working again. Dazzle is also this really cool game. It's a more traditional game, but that runs fully on chain. In a Cartesi machine. It's kind of this mix of Pokemon and Candy Crush, in our own words. Oh, Teddy, you're here?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so I heard you mention Pokemon and something. Yes, it's basically a puzzle battle game with basically your three characters or minions, however you want to call them. Well, we call them Dazzles. So our game is pretty much a hybrid of a Web 2 game and a Web 3 game. So it has modes that's completely centralized to ease the players in, and once they're comfortable, we get them to mint their characters into NFTs, and also for with a more serious mode that's fully on chain using Cartesi rollups, and at that point that's completely decentralized with more premium rewards. So I guess in terms of updates for this month, we've been we finished adding the leaderboards for the tournament mode, which is the serious mode that uses Cartesi. And right now we're finishing up on our in-game wallet flow. So to give some context, we have a built-in wallet in the game, so players don't have to be bothered to approve their each move on their MetaMask for tournament mode. So we've been right now testing and bug fixing that mode, and we're planning for a test event for players to try out the game next week. As for an exact date, I guess please join our Discord, and we'll make an announcement soon about that.
Awesome. Thanks, Teddy. Before we move to the guest speaker, David, Carlo, do you want to give a short update on Lino's prototype, his proof of concept?
Yeah, sure. So Lino's developing this game, which is a kind of mashup of different things. So it's a mashup of Steppen or Pokemon Go with Top Trump. So we have this integration with IoTex, which we use to get GPS digests of where you walked and how much. And based on that, inside the Cartesi machine, he has this database of birds and how rare they are and their location. And based on those digests, you might meet one of them, capture them. The more you walk, the higher probability of getting a rare one. And all the birds, they are these top trump-like cards that you can collect and then play with your buddy. So it's under development, and it's a really cool concept.
Awesome.
So
yeah, exciting. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or come on stage. Next up, we have David. David, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, do you want to give a bit of a background or short intro on yourself?
Sure, yeah. I'll do a really quick one, then we can dig into it if it's interesting. So I joined Electronic Arts in the early 90s, spent 10 years at EA, pretty much, and then left and ran console game makers for 10 years, and then mobile free-to-play companies for 10 years, and now 2 years building fully on-chain games at our company called Playment. So that's 33 years in 20 seconds.
That's crazy. How did you how did that transition happen? Like, how did you get into on-chain games? Like, what was your first touch point?
Do you know, maybe a good way of phrasing that is when I was making PlayStation games in a console company, and when I went to build mobile free-to-play games instead, I made the mistake of just assuming the things that I was doing on PlayStation were going to work on iPhone. which, and like we could do it technically, which is kind of impressive, but it wasn't interesting. Like it's not what people wanted to do on their phone. And it took us a little while to realize that. So when transitioning to Web3, instead of saying, well, let's just take the games we were making before and add some sort of Web3 element to it, NFTs or tokens. Instead, we said, why don't we just fast forward to what can we do now that blockchain exists? What can we do in games that we're not able to do before? And we figured that really to do that, we probably need to be fully on chain. And we, at the time when we were setting up the company and figuring out what we were going to do first, we decided to build a game based on the Loot NFT, which is, you probably know, as a sort of interoperable game asset. But like that encapsulated a lot of cool, interesting new ideas for the games industry. You start with an asset and work your way up to a number of games that will share that asset. And that sort of threw us into the deep end of building fully on-chain games. That was a game called The Crypt. That was a sort of dungeon game where you would collaborate with other loot bag holders in order to win the dungeon. And that ran directly on Ethereum, so that taught us all sorts of weird new things like community and gas optimization and solidity and these are things that you don't have to worry about if you're or don't think about if you're making a PlayStation game. So early on we've decided to go all the way to Web3 rather than stopping at Web 2.5, if you see what I mean.
Definitely. So you mentioned The Crypt, but I know you've also built some other games after that, right? Do you want to kind of get into that?
Sure. Yeah. So I would call The Crypt a proof of concept. It's like it's. I think it's important, regardless of company, regardless of industry, is just to do something quickly. So The Crypt was an example of a game that we put out in 3 months, learned some new stuff, but it was something of a proof of concept, right? It's not anything that we expected people to be playing for any length of time. And it helped us figure out what we should do next. And we decided that an on-chain MMO was something that we wanted to do next. And since releasing The Crypt, so I'm going to say for the last 14 months, we've been building an on-chain MMO called Downstream. And that's, at the moment, we're just sort of in a very early test of that game, started to introduce new players to that game. I think an important thing to ask of anybody building on-chain games is, why are you building on-chain? Like in what way does the fact that it has blockchain elements make this? Well, it's not even blockchain elements. I mean, it's actually building on-chain, which people on this call will know is technically a really difficult thing to do, and creates a lot of constraints. So an important question is to ask what do you gain by putting it on chain? And to us, the most interesting thing there is the idea of composability, or at least what I call composability, which is, sure, it's an MMO. It's an MMO that allows people in the community, the people that are playing the game, to extend what the game is. And we found this in the first game, The Crypt. I explained that we put that game out to try and learn some new things. And one of the things we learned was when people extended the game permissionless. There was a dungeon game that I described, but then people started to add new pieces of code to that, and the game became extended, not because we're live operating it, but because the community extending the game. So we really wanted to make that an integral part of this MMO, where the community of people playing the game can extend the game and add new functionality to the game. So our USP of that game, of Downstream, is this idea that anybody playing the game can extend the functionality of it.
Super interesting. How do you, I think you define a concept called digital physics, right? How do you choose what can be composable and what shouldn't be?
Oh man, that's a very good question. Like, so, first of all, a bit of terminology that may help this conversation. So we talk about a base layer and a builder layer. And the base layer is the game world that includes digital physics. And that world is immortal and immutable. Like, this game world with this physics inside it is going to exist long after I'm dead. We couldn't turn it off if we wanted to. That's the nature of it by design. And so you want a set of digital physics, and by that I mean a set of rules in the game, I suppose, that can't be changed. We call them digital physics because it's a bit like physics in our human world. Everybody has the ability, nobody has superhuman ability in our world. We're all constrained by the same set of physics. So similarly, in the game, there's a set of digital physics that constrain what the player can do. And that's what we call the base layer. And just like our human world, anybody can build experiences on top of that, but they're constrained by the digital physics. The digital physics in the world. And I think a question is, where do you draw the line between the the base layer and the builder layer? Because I think if you draw it low, where you're allowing anybody to do absolutely anything, then you sort of have a sandbox. I don't think that's particularly interesting. But then if you put it too high and just say everything has to be in order to, it ends up being too narrow, and there's not enough scope for builders to create interesting things in that world. So we try and find a balance somewhere between the two, where we're saying, hey, there's a goal of the game, but we've created digital physics that allow you to build a wide set of things in the world without breaking the game, and while still hopefully pushing players toward a goal. So I don't know, there's a bunch of new ideas in there that I just described, different terminology, but does that description make sense?
No, 100%. Could you give maybe an example of what that would look like? I know I watched a video, but I don't think everyone in the audience watched it. But where you explained, for example, the concept of a player having a sword, or having to fight a dragon, and then some other player maybe is able to craft a sword because he found some iron. How do you maintain sort of a balance between the resources of the world and the power that those resources might give the sword?
So for context, as you say, it's an MMO, so players are moving around the map and battling dragons and joining clans and typical MMO stuff. I'm not really saying there's an innovation in that game mechanic. That's a place pattern that we've all seen before in MMOs. The innovation is that we're allowing players to create things that weren't there before to extend the game. And so, yes, there's an example that we use, which is, hey, somebody could deploy a factory that turns iron into swords. And previously there weren't swords in the game, and now there are swords in the game. And that's that's fun, that's interesting. That's people in the community extending what the game is. But then there's a challenge of, how do you stop people deciding that they're going to create swords of 1 million damage? Because now, the game is imbalanced, stops becoming fun to play, and the game breaks, basically. And so our solution for that, and I suppose a definition of our digital physics, is the things that people can create in the world inherit the attributes of the things that they've been built with. So the example you gave is a factory that makes a sword, and imagine that factory makes swords out of 100 pieces of iron. That means that the swords that get created are going to have 100 atoms of attack. Importantly, it can't be 200 atoms of attack unless it's built with 200 pieces of iron. And it means that because we procedurally generate the distribution of those resources, of iron, of wood, things like that, then that dictates that the things that are created in the world can't become imbalanced. And so there's again, maybe similar to our world, right? We can't create a thing of 1 million damage unless we collect things that are very hard or in high quantity. I'm not sure that's a good example, but that's how that system works.
Interesting, yeah. Maybe taking a step back, like you mentioned that, as a game builder, you have to think about what does the medium that you're using actually offer, and why would you use, for example, blockchain in this case to build your game. You mentioned composability, but I guess like autonomous worlds or having sort of something that exists forever is also something you're touching on here. What is sort of like your vision for that? Like, where do you think this could, what do you think this could lead to, and how do you think this could benefit players, I guess?
I think autonomous worlds is about the most interesting innovation in the games industry that I've seen in the last 10 years, and nobody knows about it. And even people that talk about it often don't fully understand what it is, and it's evolving. Like, so it's a, but yeah, I would say this idea of autonomous worlds is one where such a powerful idea that this world that I create is immutable and immortal, and the people within it own and operate the world. And that's completely different from how games are built historically. So you take a World of Warcraft, Blizzard has God rights, admin mode to the world. They can decide what's in it. They can censor stuff they don't like. Sure, it's a fun game to play, and people can experience the fun things that Blizzard have built for them in World of Warcraft. But ultimately, the people in the world are second-class citizens to Blizzard. Who, I'm not. World of Warcraft's a gay game. I'm just saying this is different. I'm saying now there's our company Playment's ability to affect what's going on in the world is no different from anybody playing the game. And so that parity of status within the world, I think, is interesting and not something the games industry has ever seen before. You have this world that lives forever, that can't change, where everybody, including the original gods that made the world, has equal rights to build and operate and monetize in that world. And if you think this ability to iterate what's in there and extend what the game is, a lot of people say, oh, that sounds a little bit like Roblox. And in some senses, it is. It's not a bad place to start. But of course, Roblox has a God mode. The Roblox company dictates what goes on in that world, or at least curates and polices what goes on in that world. They also heavily tax what goes on in that world. And also those, when people in the Roblox community create different game experiences with mods or new content, then it becomes fragmented. I can go to this version of Roblox and play Adopt a Pet, and then I can go to this version, this world in Roblox, and play Hunger Games or something. And so they're, in a way, lots of separate game worlds, all with a common interface and game, made with a common game. Here what we're saying is that all players exist in one world, and these modifications, extensions to the world are available to all players in one place. So it's it's got some really interesting elements to it. And just what we're creating is a baby step toward an autonomous world, or a very primitive version of that. But that sort of high-level idea of parity in this world, similar to our human world, is a really interesting idea, and really interested to be along that path.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's a really interesting concept to think about. And I also feel like I haven't fully grasped the implications of it yet. Also, just in terms of like, how do you, balance the things we discussed, such as, digital physics, etc. It seems like a lot of stuff to think about. But I'm curious.
I can't tell you how many. Yeah, and I'll stop you there. Like, normally when a game is made, the games that I've made in the past, or everybody makes, you're sort of taking 80% old game and adding some, and 20% of this game, and there you go, that's the new game. Here, there's so many things that are being done from first principles. As you say, like how all this stuff works, the digital physics, but there's censorship resistance, then what's going to happen? Like, I can't control the things that happen in that world. So is that a bug or is that a feature? And it seems like a small change, but there's so many new things to figure out. And I'm pretty sure that a game that's an autonomous world will end up feeling really different for players because it's fundamentally different from games that came before it.
Yeah, 100%. What's like the ideal scenario for you, like for an autonomous world, or for, downstream, for example? What would be like the where would you like it to go?
Well, I think this is a bit of a non-answer, isn't it? But the answer is I don't know, and that's what's fun about it. Like whenever I live operate a game, I've got a roadmap of things that I plan to do over the next year or two, and gradually roll those out. And of course, they're affected by the community, but pay attention to what the community is interested in doing, and look at analytics to see what players are doing. But here I have no idea how this game is going to evolve, and it comes down to anthropology almost. Like, what do people want to do? When you give players the ability to extend the game in any way that they think is interesting, then what do? Do they fight? Do they cooperate? Are they creative? Are they all these things? Is it is it like the dark web, or is it is it like Second Life? I don't know. And I think the fun thing for me and anybody that's part of the game is that you don't know what's going to happen day to day, week to week. And that's one of the things that I think it makes any autonomous world an interesting thing to be involved with. So as I say, sorry, Max, that's a bit of a non-answer, but I think the fun thing is that we don't quite know. I mean, what we've seen in our playtest, just to be a little less elusive, I suppose, is we've been doing an external playtest for the last week, and people created, what did they create? A postage system. So you could go to a post office and post a letter or take an item from one side of the map to the other. So you can deposit something there and pay money to somebody to take it from one point in the map to a post office the other side of the map in order to save you having to take it there yourself. And that was, a small feature, but I love the idea that that's, a piece of functionality that's now being added to the game where you don't have to transport things around yourself. You can pay things, and conversely, you can decide, I'm going to make money by taking things from one side of the map to the other. Or somebody created a cinema, or somebody created a clan system. And all of these, interestingly, and I speak to the EVE Online team, and who are also doing a blockchain project, but I was talking to them about EVE as we know it now. And they're talking about the fact that they, of course, pay attention to what the community wants to see in the game, and they're quite vocal, and EVE, to the team at CCP, are great at listening to feedback and then incorporating that into the next build of the game. But the fundamental difference here is that they don't have to wait for us to build that functionality. People playing the game want to see that functionality, then they can build it into the game. I had no plans to build a post office or a cinema, but the people playing the game thought that would be a useful thing to have in it. So that's now part of the game. So a couple of, we've only been running a test for a couple of weeks, so early examples, but so much fun to watch.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm curious, is there still like sort of a goal or something you as a player have to maximize for, such as, a currency or resources or something, or is that sort of also in the open? Like, is that part of like the digital physics, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a goal to the game. I think about it, you can maybe categorize MMOs in two ways. One is a theme, what I call a theme park MMO, or maybe it's proper terminology, I don't know. But World of Warcraft is an example of a theme park MMO. You go to this world, and there's a set of things that Blizzard has created for you to play with your friends. And great way of running an MMO. You can also have an emergent MMO. EVE Online is an example of an emergent MMO where it's very much emergent gameplay where players are interacting with each other and deciding what they're going to do, and then other clan members or corporations are reacting to what happens there. So of the two, we're very much in the latter. We're certainly emergent. That said, we have created a game goal where you have to go and achieve this, then this, and if you do this, then you quote-unquote win. But in a way, that's just to get the party started. I don't really think that's the game. I think it's just a little bit tough if you throw someone into a game and it's not clear what to do. So that's almost like a getting started thing, I suppose. And the other thing I would say is that we've added that bit of gameplay to say, here's what you should be doing. But in this world where I have parity in terms of what I can build with everybody else in the world, anybody's free to create a game that has a mission and create something that's a competitor in terms of gameplay to what we present to players in game.
Interesting, yeah. So you could have multiple or almost an infinite amount of games sort of happening in parallel within that world. And they're all
I think
governed by... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and there's a sort of Darwinism to that, like the things that aren't interesting or fun will die, and the thing, or maybe just call it optimization, right? And the things that, or meritocracy, the things that are fun, the things that people will spend time and money and be engaged with. And I like that idea of sort of self-optimizing rather than just me hoping that we get a gameplay experience that's exactly right for the people playing it. So yes, I think you mentioned resources. So certainly, in order to do things in the game, you're sort of gathering resources and crafting things, and that's how you beat bigger monsters. And there is a currency in the game. It's certainly not a play-to-earn game, or really, it's certainly not been built that way. But as is typical in MMOs, gathering resources, trading with other players, etc., is a part of the digital physics, I suppose.
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't know, I was trying to think of the parallels with like real life, right? Like you kind of, I don't know, you try to maximize for resources as well to a certain extent, or, other things like happiness, or, I mean, everyone has different values, but I guess you could have something similar as well. And you could draw some parallels to autonomous world, I suppose, where people have different...
Yeah, and like, I don't know, like what people want to do, what they feel is important. I'm certainly confident that the idea that everybody's just there to have sort of military dominance or economic dominance, I think isn't correct. I think people play games for all sorts of reasons. I think sort of social interaction and status is maybe more powerful than those things I just mentioned. So I'm certainly not assuming that everybody's just going to start a big war in the game. But equally, I don't know, and nor can I control it.
Yeah, that's great. By the way, if anyone else has questions, feel free to come on stage or drop some messages in the chat. David, I'm curious, so there's also this concept of modding, right, that exists in the gaming community or in the gaming world. Mm-hmm. How do you see modding sort of work with blockchain games?
I talk specifically about how it works for on-chain games, or maybe even just for us. And modding is probably the closest word that we have, but also modding isn't quite what it is, because modding, right, there's two types of modding that we're familiar with in the world of games. One is sort of client-side modding, where your version of Skyrim or GTA looks a little different from somebody else's based on how they've chosen to modify the client. And then there's server modifications, which is the things that I was talking about earlier, where in Minecraft or Roblox or games like that, you can create different game worlds where you can do different things and have different objectives and have different rules of the game. Now we're talking about something a bit different, which is that it's modifications, but they don't create they don't fracture into separate game worlds with separate rules. They're modifications that are server side or blockchain side that affect all players immediately. And an important thing there, well, I guess the first one is that everybody gets to see everybody else's modifications instantly. But the other one, and perhaps more interesting, is that the modifications that I make to that world can affect the modifications that you make from that world. So in my example, I haven't thought this through, but you can see that somebody could create a post office, as I just mentioned, as happened in the game, and then maybe somebody else creates a pirate or, I don't know, system that intercepts the postage system. But they don't exist in separate worlds, and therefore there's the opportunity for these different things to interact with each other, which I think is more interesting than things existing in silos.
Yeah, interesting. There's also the component of just changing the visual appearance of things, right? Because the post office could be, could look like a spaceship post office or a real world post office. How do you see that part? Because in your game, for example, if someone creates a post office, does he also sort of enforce what the post office will look like visually? I guess it's slightly less interesting than the changing the game rules, but it's also a component.
Yeah, it's a good question and something that we had to ask ourselves at the beginning. And we decided that rather than allowing players to make it look however they'd like, then we have a bunch of different things that it can look like. And we did that for a few reasons. I think the main one was that we didn't want to put any graphical barrier to entry up for players. So if in order to extend the game, you had to A, have some technical ability to create new functionality, and B, have artistic ability to make it look nice, then we've got two barriers, and I think that would be a concern. The other one is consistency, where we wanted the game not to look like a pinboard of lots of weird art styles, but instead has some kind of consistency. And you sort of touched on it there, that I guess maybe a third one was it's not really the most important thing in the game. I mean, I think longer term, we'd like to allow people to be a bit more expressive graphically, but that doesn't feel like where our attention should be going now. A footnote to all of this is that our client is just an interface. It's a completely dumb interface where everything is happening running on a blockchain itself. And we use Unity and React to render something in a browser that looks nice and you can move things around. It's got a nice interface, but there's nothing going on with the interface. And in fact, you could play that whole game through Etherscan if you wanted to. There's nothing unique about our interface. In theory, you could. I think in practice that would be tough. But my point is that it's just a presentation interface. And if somebody wanted to build an iPhone client in pixel art that connected to the same game world, then they could. So there is the ability to sort of change the graphics, but not within our client. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. So, quick question about coming back to that pirate thing that will affect the post office service. Do you think we need to embed some sort of government into these autonomous worlds? Because someone might just create something new that ruins the experience for everyone, right? Let's say you have this world which is balanced and everything works, and there are a lot of players that are specialized in being merchants or something alike, and then someone just finds a breach on the digital physics and creates a teleportation service or something that completely disrupts the balance of the world.
Yeah, good question. So if you think about our human world, then if I create, I've got to choose a better example, but I'm going to use this one for now. But if I decide that I'm going to open a shop in my street, in my neighborhood that sells Nazi memorabilia, then there is no hand of God that comes down and destroys that building. Instead, we, in our human world, we have sort of social structures like police and a legal system and mob rule that enforced. There's nothing to stop you creating that shop, but there are sort of social constructs in the form of governance, which is what you mentioned. So I think, whether I like it or not, I think that the reality, how humans organize, is that they will find some sort of in-game governance in order to deal with things that they don't want to see in the game. Now, if somebody finds something that fundamentally breaks the game physics and now can't be undone, and I think, frankly, that's likely, then I think we'll probably have to fork the world and create a new world and encourage people to move to the new world. But I think in sort of smaller gameplay things or in terms of censorship, then I think I would leave it to in-world governance in some form or another to manage the things that are liked and disliked within the world. And I absolutely think that's part of the game.
Okay.
Interesting.
And about extending the digital physics, right now you would need a fork, right? Or do you think you can combine just, no? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, extending the digital physics. Okay, so yeah, two things. One is that in that builder layer, players are free to deploy a smart contract that the game automatically sees, and that functionality is available to all players in the game, in the builder layer. In the digital physics, we're very clear about building digital physics, and that becomes, as quickly as possible, ideally immediately, immutable. Now, in a world where we got the digital physics wrong and somebody finds an exploit, then the only solution for that is to fork and create a new world. And maybe what happens is that in early versions of the game, we're doing that monthly. But then ideally we do it never. But you want to allow digital physics that gives enough scope for players to build interesting things. But the larger you make the digital physics, then the larger the surface area of attack is, and it feels like it's easier to find exploits in digital physics that are more complicated. And again, to use our human world, we enjoy a world that is calm from a physics point of view and stable and works and allows us to create amazing things. But of course, there was billions of worlds after the Big Bang where that wasn't the case, where the physics of the world were wrong. It just happens that there's selection bias such that we enjoy a world that appears stable. My point is, it's quite hard to get physics right, and I suspect we'll get it wrong a few times before it goes the distance, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, so it's an optimization process, right? At a certain point, we'll reach a stable enough digital physics, people will like it, and there'll be a convention that's the official world in which everyone wants to be playing and interacting.
Yeah, although I can't force people to move to a new world, I think it's important that you make that world one immutable. Otherwise, it's not really an autonomous world, and that's against what we're trying to achieve here. I want a completely decentralized world, and so if we have admin rights and we can still upgrade those contracts, then that admin, that God mode exists, and that's what we're trying to get away from. So I think the solution is to create a better world too, just as Christopher Columbus settled America. Again, don't know if that's a good example, but encourage people to move to a new world because because it's better in some way, or fix the things that the community feels are broken.
Question. Do you think there's room for non-composable and unchangeable on-chain games?
Yeah, I do. Good question. So, as I say, we've been building on-chain games for a couple of years now, and I always ask anybody building an on-chain game, why is it on-chain? Because I think that's important to be able to articulate to anybody. And what I've seen, I think you have had Stockash maybe on a previous call, who made this game Rascal. I think in my view, that's an example of a game that has hyper-financialization, where if you think that blockchain adds financialization to games, it's sort of you can tokenize something and turn it into something of value that you can then have some liquidity. Or something on chain has those elements, but also has the advantages of being immutable and completely transparent and trustworthy and unbuggable. And so I think another category of on-chain games that I've seen is this concept of hyper-financialization. So I think that's a second category that's it's interesting in on-chain games, but not what we're doing, but I know others are doing. And then there's another, I can't point to games that are doing this, but certainly experiments that are doing this, where a game might be, the metagame is kept fully on-chain, and the actual game sessions themselves are improvable game sessions. So if you imagine, again, I don't think this is quite right, but if you imagine a game of Street Fighter, that the results of or the moves of which are built into a ZK proof, and that proof is then verified on chain. So it's a verifiable result that then in that on-chain higher level builds into some kind of metagame. So I think that we'll also start to see those kind of games where sessions are built into proofs and then make up part of a metagame that runs completely on chain. So that third type of game is a little harder to describe, a little less well defined. But I suppose that's a point, which is that as more time is being spent in the on-chain game space with more teams, then more game ideas or game categories within it are starting to form.
And also, what do you think are some ways that these on-chain sort of physics layers can generate revenue or incentivize people to build on top of them?
Yeah, great question. So our monetization strategy is simple on the surface, a little more clever underneath, I think. So when we, and this might get a little technical, but when we, I'm used to building free-to-play games where the game is basically free, but in order to do things in the game, that they might cost a currency, which is a very standard business model for games. And in a way, we do something similar, where we're saying to play the game, you need tokens, energy tokens, we call them. And as the player does things in the game, then those tokens are spent. Now, so again, as I said, it's not an unusual business model for a game that I just described, where players spend coins doing things that they want to in game, and that's how revenue is made. I think a couple of things. First of all, we're not planning on actually putting that into the game for a while. We're focusing on other things like composability. But the other point is that the way the energy system works that I just mentioned is that the tokens that are spent by the player, some of which should go to the person that created that experience. So maybe if I'm using the post office, I have to pay 10 gold coins to the person delivering the parcel and 1 gold coin to the person that built the post office. So if you build things in game, then you accumulate tokens that can then be turned back into ETH using a smart contract. So some of it is going to the people that created the experience, that whoever it is as a builder, not just us as a company. Some of which is going to a treasury to run the game. And the other one is that some of it is going to a sequencer. So the game has a built-in sequencer, or we allow players to, in the community, in order to keep it fully decentralized, we allow people to run a sequencer. And the sequencer actually pays for the gas on the player's behalf. A nice side effect of that is that we're not asking people, we don't have MetaMask pop-ups asking people for gas, and you don't have to worry about crypt. You do it currently, but ultimately we hope to get to a point where that gas, handling of gas for transactions is obfuscated away by the game, which we think is preferable. So a quick summary there. As players are playing the game, let's imagine they spent $50 getting 500 units of energy, tokens of energy, some of which go to the thing that the player's experiencing, the post office or whatever. Some of it goes to a treasury for management of the game. And the third thing is some of it's going to a sequencer to pay for the gas, such that the transactions can be pushed through a blockchain.
Makes sense. And also, like, what are some ways you think these physics layers can incentivize people to build on top of them in a financial?
So Matt, that post office that I described wasn't built by us. It was, built by somebody external to the game, external to us as a company, and so I mean, it doesn't have tons of players, nor is that monetization system really in the game yet, but. In that example, the person that built the post office would receive a gold coin every time somebody used the post office functionality. So there's a sort of meritocracy there. If you build something cool that people love using in the game, then you see a revenue stream as people use it.
And do you think there's a need for something to protect people from cloning good ideas and stealing them? Because in this case, the guy that created the post office is probably going to get a major revenue out of it, right? And I guess the same problem we have in our world, right? Someone comes up with a great concept. How do you protect that person from someone else cloning it and making it famous before the original creator?
Yeah, good question. And actually, you sort of stumbled on. You gave the same answer I would. I think, which is that it's comparable to our own world in a sense that I can permissionlessly deploy any internet service and hope that people love it. But there's nothing that's stopping somebody coming along and do something similar. There are social contracts in place that say, that's too similar, or there's a trademark or something like that. But I think it will work in a similar way, which is that maybe people will trust a certain type of building and will ignore the copycat. Or if the copycat has something that has improved functionality, then people may start using that one instead. But I think that's feature, not bug. Or maybe a more honest answer is I don't really know. So we're not putting things in the game to prevent that. And any smart contract, when deployed through our deployment system, is open source and available for everybody to see. I.e., you can see the Solidity smart contract that creates that functionality. So there wouldn't be someone stopping them doing Post Office version 2 that had some different functionality. But my gut sense is that's okay for now.
Cool. Super interesting. Anyone else have any questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat or come on stage. David, maybe we can touch a bit on the stack as well, like the technical side. So you mentioned, you run your own sequencer. You also mentioned, I believe, that you used client-side proofs for your games. Could you expand a bit on that as well?
Yeah, I'm not the CTO, but so I might get over my skis at some point. But one of the things we found, blockchains weren't designed to be running as game servers, as we all know, right? So it was like going back to a 16-bit computer or something and trying to get it to be a game server. And I remember when it happened in the office where the game designer said, all right, well, we want obviously big battles with monsters in the game. And the developers are sort of screwing up their nose and saying, that's a lot of computation for a blockchain. Like, does the dragon live or die? What are the rewards? What are the hit points? What's the, has they got armor and defense? And there's just a calculation. It was quite a big calculation, that battle. And running everything directly on a chain was potentially problematic, or when I say problematic, I mean probably expensive. It's the main thing, or slow, or both. And so the solution that we have for that is that when there's something that involves a lot of computation, is rather than running that directly on a blockchain, what we do is we move that client side, i.e. to the player's computer, and we run it client side. So anybody that's part of that battle can run the blockchain is still logging events, but those events are then, the results of those events are then calculated in a ZK proof circuit that then is verified on chain. And obviously verification of that proof is still, it still has some computation associated with it, so it's not free, but that's fixed. And so when there's computation beyond a certain amount, then we'll move that client side, build it into a proof, and have that verified on chain. So it's sort of elegant system that allows us to scale a little better.
Sweet. And you're currently on Optimism, right? I believe.
Truthfully, we're not. We have a version of the game that runs on OP Stack. Yes, OP Stack. That's settling actually on an Ethereum test network, so on Sepolia. So I think we're about to do that next week or something. And worth maybe talking about why that is and maybe our journey. I mentioned that we were on Ethereum initially. Ethereum is running things directly on Ethereum is super expensive. It's like $20 a move on that game, the Crypt, which is not, doesn't really work. And then then we moved to Starknet, and Starknet, certainly when we were working on it, which was last March, was slow transaction times, and we love layer 2s. I think that's a good scaling solution, but still expensive and slow. So it wasn't ready for us. And then we moved to Polygon, but Polygon's a side chain, or Polygon proof of stake is a side chain. So that doesn't feel right for our decentralization maxis that we are. And then I was sort of hoping that Polygon ZK EVM would be a suitable migration for us. And still, currently, the gas prices are problematically high. So we're in this sort of undesirable but basically okay situation where we're running OP Stack as a as a app-specific roll-up, and then we're settling on Sepolia test network, because that settling part is still problematically expensive if we're settling up on Ethereum. So I think that over time, people on this call will know better than me, I suspect, but I think over time that settling becomes cheaper after proto-dank sharding or dank sharding. And an advantage of being on OP Stack is that we can choose where it is that we can settle. So at some point we hope to be able to settle on something other than a test network, where when it becomes cheaper. The other thing is that because OP Stack is open source and wells, then we can make modifications to that blockchain that suit our game.
Interesting. Cool. Let me see in the chat. See, Tony says he'd like to play and test your game. It's great.
Yeah, I mean,
David, you can later on if you have any.
Yeah, I would say I don't think I'm really supposed to announce this, but anyway. But I think we actually put a link up on playmit.com today that where you can sort of dig into it. And what I will say is, by the way, if you're picturing this glorious Skyrim-like world, I'm going to manage your expectations. This is sub Minecraft, right? It's a very simple presentation layer, and that's deliberate, right? We didn't want to spend all of our development resource trying to create a beautiful tapestry of a world. That's really not what's interesting about this game. So we have very talented artists, but we're not prioritizing the aesthetic look of this game.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it makes sense to start like small anyway, and then expand from there. I see here Bruno's question. So would you say that there are are you sort of focused on Solidity development, or do you see space for alt EVMs and other execution environments that could sort of expand the game logic in a certain way? Obviously, to tout Cartesi's point, we're in that space. Just curious if you guys have faced any issues with Solidity and EVM environments.
And in my time in the games industry, I started with assembler and then C and then C++, then C Sharp, then, I'm used to moving between languages and even in the last year, I explained that we were on StartNet, so that was all in Cairo, an earlier version of Cairo, and now, we're now in Solidity. And I don't think anybody would say that Solidity is the perfect language or development environment. One thing I'm a little caught, the move from StartNet to Ethereum or layer 2 on Ethereum meant that we had to rewrite our contracts in EVM, and I'm not in a hurry to write them again move to another language, port it again. But on a more general point, one of the things I like about Web3 is the infrastructure is an absolute moving target in a good sense. Since we've been doing this, so much great infrastructure is being built at all sorts of places. The Mud engine built by a company called Lattice is a great on-chain game engine. There's a Dojo, which is another game engine that's written for StartNet. But then also there's all the infrastructure that you're involved with, where it's the infrastructure of blockchains or even more meta than that. You're creating a whole operating system runs on a blockchain. So I'm a little cautious about just jumping from hot new idea to hot new idea, because I don't think we'd ever ship a game. But I think every time every now and then we sort of put our head above the parapet and say, what's the best infrastructure to do our next thing with? And whatever it is, it's certainly improved from the last time we looked. So a bit of a vague answer, but the fact that the infrastructure around the blockchain space is improving at such a rate is fantastic.
Yeah, 100%. So much diversity as well. It's great to see so many game engines pop up, with different designs and such.
Yeah.
Maybe another question from me. Like you mentioned a few on-chain games, but are there, certain ones that, you've been playing or that you're excited about, besides obviously your games and downstream?
Yeah, there's a good... a couple of answers. One is I think that we're in a really early stage. Someone described on-chain games as a bit of a art house movement. It's a long way from the kind of games that I've built in the past, and the games, including ours, are really primitive. So I think there's games like Mithrium that I think are more advanced, which is a sort of hyper-financialized RTS that I think is interesting. Influence, another one. You mentioned Rascal, which is a very simple game that has that runs on chain. This is fun. OPCraft, I think, is something that I found really inspiring and first helped me think about this point of composability and what that could lead to. What else in the space? Tons of really interesting experiments. Words 3 is an on-chain words game. I'm just rattling around things in my head at the moment. So all of them, as I said, I think not at a point that maybe engage players for a length of time. And I think that needs to change. I feel it's like my job to create games that are doing interesting new things, but are also engaging players so that they're coming back and playing them every day, as you would expect in a quote-unquote normal game. So I think a valid criticism of the on-chain game space right now is that they're somewhere between science experiments and things you would call games. And I'm looking forward to, in the next year or so, the games becoming games in and of themselves rather than science experiments. One thing I've noticed is that a year ago, when I was talking about on-chain games to investors and other people outside our world, then people had no idea what I was talking about. And I was having to red pill people every time I started a conversation. And it's a complicated thing to explain. I've just spent 45 minutes talking about this to get the point across. I think what we need to do is start creating games that demonstrate it rather than just a bunch of people talking about what it is. And that's what I want to see change. What I have noticed is that there's now a lot more inbound interest, people understanding what on-chain games are and what they can be, and want to talk to us about it. And that's a much healthier position than a year ago. And it's also bringing a lot more investment. I think that of all the things that are happening in Web3 games, then on-chain games has proven to be more credible, more interesting, maybe opening the door to a lot more new ideas than, and I'm not being disparaging, but Web 2.5 maybe has less of that. So it may be easier to get something up and running quickly, but less versatile in a set of new things that you can do.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. All right. Does anyone else want to ask some questions? Or David, maybe you have some questions for us or for people in the room.
From what I've described about, building an on-chain game where we're focusing on, let's talk about three things: immutability, so this digital physics of the world, the immortality, and then this, very importantly, this point about composability, the fact that the world is extendable by the people playing the game. How do you think Cartesi will, do you think it benefits that? The game that I described, how do you think Cartesi can benefit a game like ours?
A great question. I don't think we have an answer, but basically with our tech, you can think of having a supercomputer from blockchain point of view that you can interact with. So you mentioned the problem you had with the battles that were really expensive, and then you calculate zero knowledge proofs and you verify them on chain. Still, I think they might be short computations from our point of view, because you can generate zero knowledge proof. So if you take a look at the zero knowledge rollups out there, right now they reached a breakthrough in which they can actually keep up with Ethereum in real time. So they have this cluster of supercomputers that manage to calculate zero knowledge proof for Ethereum transactions every 13 seconds or so. And that's a major breakthrough from what they were able to. Ethereum with 30 million gas per block, if you take a look at the simplest OP code, which is adding or subtracting, it's 3 gas. It's basically 10 million transactions, 10 million operations, sorry. So that's like 10 million operations every 13 seconds. Just booting Linux, it's 37 million operations we do on our RISC-V machine. So yeah, it's not feasible. And then in 13 seconds, we can do like 3.7 billion instructions on a laptop. So that's a computational scale that you cannot do on a zero knowledge, right? So if you think about some really nice simulation, things like this, zero knowledge is not feasible. On chain, it's not feasible as well. So Cartesi, I think, brings a good ingredient in this kind of stuff. Ultrachess from Jesse is a good example. So you have this chess match, which you have a bot, and this bot has an arbitrarily complex logic. And if you would try to make a zero knowledge proof out of it or anything like that, I don't think it will be feasible. Do you know those games like Script, in which it's this RTS game in which you program JavaScript agents to make the game run, right? This is the kind of stuff that you could do on Cartesi, and I don't think you could do with zero knowledge proofs. So
interesting.
Basically, we have great tooling because it's Linux, right, and a lot of computational power.
Yeah, really interesting. But and one thing I would say is that when we created the crypt, then we knew that we were going to be running on Ethereum, and so therefore we designed a game that could be run on Ethereum. So very, very simple, and a lot of the game was really taking part in Discord, where you're collaborating with people, and the what ran on chain was really just the execution part of that. So my point is that we designed a game that could be run on Ethereum. Now, for a second game downstream, we have more compute, we have more gas. Therefore, okay, we can build a game that has more transactions and is more complex. But still, we're really, really constraining the game design to fit something that runs on a blockchain. And I talked about sort of coming up above the parapet every time we finish something and say, what's possible now? What I look forward to is the fact that the space will have evolved significantly, I think, in terms of what's possible. So we still have this concept of ownership, ownerless computing, but now and it doesn't need to approach laptop powers, but there's still a sort of evolutionary jump to something that's a lot more powerful if you're able to do the kind of things you describe. So I think that it's certainly a good idea always when you're designing something to consider the constraints of the medium. That's what we've done. I'm looking forward to the constraints being lifted.
And answering your question about composability and stuff like this, in Cartesi, composability is a different beast, right? Because you have a server for each application. So when you think about composability of different applications, you have to go through layer one, which is expensive and also slow because you need finalization. It's not a scroll-up solution. But you can think about having something like a shared Minecraft server. And the way it evolves is anyone that plays the game can just submit their own mod. So that way you can have like an autonomous world in which everyone can collaborate and not have the issues with slow composability or something like this due to the optimistic rollups nature.
Perfect, interesting. Yeah, I look forward to digging into that.
Yeah, whenever you want, we're willing to schedule something and discuss some cool idea you might have. We're really interested in this kind of stuff.
Cool.
Awesome. David, how does everyone stay in touch with you? Where do they follow you? How do they keep up with your games and test it as early as possible? I shared already the link to the website, but if you have any other links, please share.
Yeah, I mean, if you start with Playment, you'll find me there, my Twitter, etc. I'm 10 trucks, TEN trucks, on Telegram. Always we're at a really wonderful point in on-chain games where everybody's just talking with everybody else about how to do things that haven't been done before. It's so collaborative. And I enjoy talking to people about weird things that are unsolved problems. So feel free to contact me. That's fine.
Awesome. Really appreciate that.
No worries.
Anyone else?
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, David. Yeah, thanks so much for joining.
One thing I would say is that maybe one thing I was going to add is that I'm at a games conference this week actually, and let's call it a traditional games conference. I think there's a really big task to try and undo some bad work that's happened. If I mention the B word, if I mention blockchain in the games industry to players or other game makers in the games industry, there's a lot of work to undo in terms of telling people nothing that I've said about our game really has any sort of crypto or elements to it. It's a long way from Bored Apes, etc. And I've got no beef with that world, but I think there's a real task ahead of us to really prove that there's something interesting that can be done using blockchain that couldn't exist otherwise. But we do have to undo some things. And Justin Gleber is a friend of mine that's also building on-chain games, was saying to me that if you think of it as a tech tree, like the way that we've gone in a tech tree in games or in technology, we've gone from single player to multiplayer, peer-to-peer to server client architecture. And we've sort of gone down that tech tree. Here, a new tech tree is created of ownerless computing via a blockchain decentralized database. and it's been sort of bundled up with a bunch of stuff, bundled up with this bunch of capitalist stuff that to me is less interesting. But it'd be same to just cut off that tech tree because people dislike some things that it was bundled with. Do you see what I mean?
No, 100%. How do you go about showing the good side of blockchain? Yeah.
Well, talk is cheap.
Some work.
Talk is cheap, and everyone's talking on Twitter about pumping up the things that they're doing. So I think the best thing we can do, me and everybody else, is shut up and actually build something that demonstrates some of these things that we're talking about, because anybody can talk about it, but the way of actually demonstrating that it's something different is saying, well, here you go, see if you like it, this is what it is.
Preach. Yeah, no, 100%. I like that. Awesome. Then I think we can close off this call a bit earlier, unless anyone else wants to chit chat a bit more. It's also fine. I will, if no one says anything, I'll take that as a let's close this call early. But David, thanks for the great talk from Bruno. Oh, thank you. Great. Yeah, again, David, thanks again for joining, and everyone else as well for being here. And looking forward to the next one in about a month, probably. Yeah, great. Thanks, guys.
Really cool, guys.
Thanks for having me. Really cool.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.